Welcome. My name is John Flett. I'm a specialist pediatrician who helps parents, teachers, and kids that think and learn differently. You know, ADHD is not necessarily the answer to everything. Could in fact your child's problem be also a learning problem or a learning problem without ADHD? An ADHD diagnosis is not always the answer. You know, we need to learn about certain red flags like the inability to communicate or difficulty remembering facts. So in this video, I'm going to tell you about why and how learning disabilities could be the cornerstone of your child's problems, and we need to look holistically at everything. It might mean that your child is struggling with a learning disability. So let me give an example of a child who was diagnosed with ADHD and the first grade, right? And then in the fifth grade, his parents brought him to see me because he was doing badly at school. He was struggling. He wasn't really doing as well. The parents say, look, he's on his medication. Why isn't he doing so well? So although his hyperactivity, inattention were well under control, but he had difficulty in retaining information, things that he read, knowing what to write when he was assigned work. And I'm not an educational specialist, but in my experience dealing with children, I've got screening techniques, and I was able during my evaluation to show that he had both a learning disability and ADHD. Let me give you an example of another child who was in the 8th grade and was basically failing all her grades and courses. And her teachers said to the parents, look, I think that you need to have your child be assessed for ADHD because she had difficulty maintaining her attention. She wasn't doing her homework, and she wasn't very good doing her work independently in class. But she didn't have those problems in any other settings. The parents, during the interview, convinced me that there wasn't a problem at home. She didn't have the core symptoms of ADHD. So, you know, this is a case of where her problems, you know, had not been there right early on. They'd only presented themselves basically at the start of high school. So during my assessment, I could show that she had problems with her reading, writing, math skills. And from the teachers and looking at her reports, it was clear that she also struggled with some organization and time management. This young lady had a learning disability. The absence of kind of chronic history of inattention from an early age ruled out ADHD. So this is a case where a child presents like ADHD but does not have ADHD, has a learning disability. And, you know, between 30 and 50% of all children with ADHD also have learning disabilities. And of course, the reverse is also true. And as a result, it's very important and wise for parents with a child who has ADHD to go to somebody who can see the big picture. And that's something I often see, is that a child who's not doing well on medication is because sometimes they've got maybe inadequate treatment or they might have a learning difficulty. So the case that I've described illustrates that this is a problem that can confuse both parents as well as teachers. Because at high school, I think high school teachers assume that these learning difficulties have been sorted out, but they can slip through the net, particularly if a child is bright, they've been given lots of coaching, lots of extra help. And then, of course, at high school, they've got to be on their own. They've got many teachers, and one teacher can't keep an eye on everything. So if it's not recognized early, you know, the child might present with ADHD-like symptoms, fiddling, doodling, looking around the room, and can mistakenly lead a parent or teacher to think that the child has ADHD. So, you know, what we want to do is you can't just blame the victim. And we can't necessarily also allow the teachers just to say, she's not working hard enough. She needs to motivate herself. Um, you know, or he'd have less trouble if only he'd paid attention and stopped, his social media and playing PlayStation. Have you ever heard of kind of these things? It's a common scenario sometimes. So no child wants to do badly. I've never seen a child who really tried to do their worst. Children want the easiest route. They want to kind of please. They want to do their best. But sometimes they just can't. So before we blame a child, we need to find out why they're not being successful and doing and unlocking what they're capable of. So some of the red flags that I'd like you to think about when you are suspecting that your child might have a learning disability. Is there a family history of this? Sometimes I think as parents, I often chat to parents, it's almost like a denial of what happened back at school. A lot of parents had difficulties almost trying to blank it out, shut it out. And say, look, I enjoy reading now. I don't have any problem with my writing. But then they're making use of technology to help them. And early on, when those technologies weren't available, they did have difficulty. They didn't like school. So things like dyslexia, dysgraphia, or dyscalculia, which is a maths learning disability, needs to be picked up as soon as possible. So at preschool, the red signs, the red flags are communication problems, such as slow language development, difficulty speaking, understanding, or, communicating their thoughts. Poor motor communication or coordination, but clumsy, difficulty in cutting out, colouring in, problems with memory, routine, dealing with multiple instructions. Difficulty socializing can also be a sign that they're having difficulty with learning difficulties, difficulty interacting with other kids. Early sort of middle school, problems with letter recognition, familiar words by sight, difficulty learning phononyms. There's little units of sound in English. There are 44 phononyms, sounding out words. Problems with letter formation and numbers, difficulty learning math skills, calculation, mental maths, remembering facts, difficulty organizing their materials, notebooks, information, concepts, losing, forgetting things, and of course, not understanding oral instructions, difficulty expressing themselves. And then later, difficulty with independent reading, retaining what they read, difficulty organizing their thoughts in written form, difficulty learning new concepts and applying them, difficulty organizing personal materials. And then in high school, difficulty reading assignments, papers, getting things in on time, increased difficulty with organization and more independent work. So one of the things that I find in my practice is that when a child has these difficulties, even when they're seen by a psychologist, a lot of the advice is, particularly if a child has a difficulty and they're picked up earlier, if there's a difficulty, it means it's a bit more severe. If it's picked up later, it's going to be less severe. But in both cases, it needs intervention and help. And medication with ADHD is not necessarily going to help your child. When a child is picked up with a problem early on, I often, unfortunately, sometimes even psychologists, they say, well, there's a problem with language, but, maybe just go and do some speech therapy or extra help. We've got to wait until your child is old enough to make a diagnosis of something like dyslexia. Because it's almost a sensitive point. They don't want to mention the fact that your child could have a difficulty with language. They don't want to mention the word dyslexia. Elsewhere in the world, these things can be diagnosed at age 6. These screening techniques before. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we don't really have those kind of awareness and the skilled professionals to make a diagnosis. That's one of the big frustrations I have in my practice. I recognize these issues like dyslexia, and yet it's like kicking the can down the road. If you get your child help early on, I would implore you to really kind of Make sure that your child gets the right help. Make sure that your child has the right diagnosis. Because, being given a particular diagnosis like dyslexia, it unlocks accommodations. Just imagine that child with that red pen through their work all the time. The impact on their self-esteem is massive. And of course, medication's not going to help that. A child could also have ADHD. So, you need to know what to expect. A learning disability presents itself in various ways. We need to know how it's going to present at different ages. Preschool, in addition to socializing skills, children begin to improve their motor skills. In kindergarten, a child should develop rapid letter recognition, many sounds associations, number concepts. Now, these are things that are not going according to plan. We need to think about things like dyslexia and dyscalculia. In the first grade, a child starts to learn to read, blend out sounds, letters, and the basic maths concepts need to kind of be understood. And of course, third and fourth grade, the shift of focus, developing skills that they need to use beyond just audio-visual. A child then needs to understand to read. You spend the first couple of years at school learning to read, and then you need reading to learn. So things like spelling, grammar, and so forth. That is when those issues with language issues like dyslexia appear. So, at high school, if things haven't been picked up, it can be catastrophic. And, a child then needs to kind of have a different type of intervention. But, those are things that you need to think about early on. The earlier we start to develop screening techniques and help children, the quicker we can develop and help them. So I thought that would just give you an idea as to, if you think your child has a learning problem, let us know. And don't let people tell you that you've got to wait until your child's old enough to make a diagnosis. Or just carry on doing kind of therapy, speech therapy, a little bit of extra work. That can cause a huge impact on your child's self-esteem. Anyway, if those are things that you want to know more about, let me know.